You won't believe what happened, but then again, given the petty tyrannies that fester in those manicured cul-de-sacs, maybe you will. It began, as these things often do, with a violation so brazen, so utterly contemptuous of law and decency, that it served as a clarion call. I saw the sign from half a block away, a splash of insolent red against the green of my own damn trees, the ones my grandfather planted. Sold. Just like that. On my driveway. My land. My home. A place that wasn't just property, but marrow and memory. The air punched out of my lungs, replaced by something cold and hard, something I hadn't felt since I put away my old life, the one where I dealt with men who thought rules were for other people. Mr. Abernathy, the HOA president, a man whose primary source of power seemed to stem from the meticulous cataloging of mismatched trash bin lid colors, had apparently graduated from passive-aggressive newsletters to grand larceny. My wife, Sarah, her face a mask of stunned disbelief, clutched my arm. My son, barely a teenager, just stared. The easy confidence of youth momentarily shattered. This wasn't a fine for uncut grass or a misplaced garden gnome. This was an erasure. A declaration that we, in our own home, were ghosts, already dispossessed. The blood in my veins, usually a slow, steady current, began to thrum with a rhythm I recognized, the prelude to focused, methodical dismantling. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know what lines they hadn't just crossed, but obliterated. The initial shock, that raw, visceral punch of seeing your sanctuary defiled by a stranger's decree, quickly calcified into a diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't just about a house. This was about the principle. This was about the quiet audacity of evil that believes itself unaccountable. The sold sign wasn't just a piece of painted metal, it was a gauntlet thrown, a challenge I had no intention of declining. My mind, trained to dissect complex deceptions, began to whirl, sifting through possibilities, each more ludicrous than the last, yet converging on a single, chilling point. Henderson, that puffed-up potentate of the petunias, had somehow orchestrated this. The calm that descended was not peace, but the Arctic stillness before a storm. The fight wasn't coming. It had arrived, uninvited, on my doorstep, and I, the reluctant warrior they mistook for a placid suburbanite, was about to answer. The emotional anchor of my family, their bewildered faces, became the fuel. This wasn't just my fight. It was for them, for the sanctity of every home Henderson and his ilk believed they could casually extinguish. The surgical precision with which I would operate would be a testament to that protective loyalty. The first step, however, wasn't rage, but reconnaissance. That sign was a symptom. I needed the disease. The local bank, a folksy establishment named Pioneer Trust, was where the disease had apparently metastasized. Their online listings, usually a dreary procession of foreclosures and modest starter homes, held a new, particularly galling entry: my address, my acreage, my life, itemized and priced like a discount appliance. The listing photos were recent, taken with a chilling familiarity, angles suggesting someone had walked my land, cataloging its features for market. Prime development opportunity, the description crowed. Motivated seller. HOA. Facilitated. A word so bland, so bureaucratic, for an act of such profound theft. The claim, as I later discovered through a preliminary, very pointed inquiry with a bank vice president, who looked increasingly like a cornered rodent, was based on a lien. A fraudulent lien, naturally, alleging years of unpaid dues and covenant violations, so laughably fabricated they might have been penned by a malevolent satirist. Henderson's signature, a florid, self-important scrawl, adorned the forged documents. He hadn't just sold my house, he'd attempted to erase my ownership with counterfeit paper and a breathtaking assertion of non-existent authority. The bank, it seemed, had asked no inconvenient questions, content to process the transaction with the same due diligence one might apply to a bake sale. Or perhaps, and this was a colder thought, they were not merely negligent, but complicit. The initial calls were met with a carefully constructed wall of corporate politeness, the kind that mistakes stonewalling for professionalism. "We'll look into it," they chirped, as if I were reporting a misplaced deposit slip, not the grand theft of my entire existence. The deadpan sarcasm that rose in me was a defense mechanism, a way to process the sheer, unadulterated lunacy. "Oh, you will?" I'd wanted to say. "Take your time. It's only my life you're auctioning off." But I kept my tone level, my words clipped. They needed to understand this wasn't a complaint. It was a notification of impending legal evisceration. The moral violation was absolute. This wasn't a dispute over property lines or the height of a hedge. This was the systemic, deliberate attempt to steal a family's foundation through a conspiracy of arrogance and, potentially, criminal negligence. The details of the fake claim, the precise wording, the dates, all of it I absorbed with cold, analytical fury. Each lie was a nail I would later use to seal Henderson's coffin. The image of that bank listing, my home, displayed like a piece of meat, burned itself into my retinas, a constant, visceral reminder of what was at stake. The fight was escalating internally, the initial shockwave solidifying into a tactical battle plan. They thought they were dealing with a homeowner. They were about to meet a man who understood the architecture of their flimsy, corrupt world far better than they did. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, not in the conventional sense. It was to Marcus Thorne, a man whose digital footprints were lighter than a whisper but whose ability to unearth digital skeletons was legendary. We'd navigated murkier waters than this in a past life, dismantling operations that made Henderson's petty fiefdom look like a child's sandcastle. "Marcus," I said, my voice devoid of preamble, "I have a situation. Suburban warfare, heavy on the fraud." A dry chuckle on the other end. "Thought you'd retired to the land of lawnmowers and PTA meetings, old friend." "The natives are restless," I replied. "And one of them just tried to sell my teepee out from under me. That was all it took." Marcus, a conspiracy theorist with an uncanny knack for being right, and a tech wizard who could make servers sing confessions, was in. His price was usually steep, but for me, it was the thrill of the hunt. They didn't know who I was. I muttered to myself after the call, a refrain that was becoming my mantra. They didn't know that my retirement was merely a sabbatical from a career spent taking down men far more dangerous, far more insulated, than a jumped-up HOA president. My dormant authority, the kind that came from years as a chief auditor for a branch of government that didn't advertise its successes, was stirring. The tools were different now, not clandestine meetings and sealed indictments, but civil procedure and forensic accounting. Yet, the objective was the same: expose the rot, excise the cancer. Henderson had made a critical error. He'd assumed I was like the others, the silent majority of neighbors who grumbled but ultimately complied with his increasingly bizarre edicts. He'd mistaken quietude for weakness. The tactical retaliation wouldn't be a single barrage, but a campaign. First, secure the immediate perimeter. A lis pendens filed against my own property. A legal shot across the bow that would freeze any sale. Then, a deep dive into the HOA's financials. Something I suspected would be a Pandora's box of mismanagement and self-enrichment. Marcus would handle the digital archaeology. I would handle the paper trails, the legal architecture of our counteroffensive. The family was my emotional anchor, their initial fear now morphing into a quiet, supportive anger mirroring my own. My wife, Sarah, a woman of immense inner strength, began meticulously documenting every interaction, every piece of mail, every whispered rumor from concerned neighbors who were too afraid to speak up. This wasn't just about getting our house back. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt structure Henderson had built. The moral violation was clear. The tactical response would be overwhelming. The intensely personal had become strategically impersonal, emotion channeled into precision. Marcus worked with the speed and ferocity of a digital wolverine. "You won't believe this," he'd call, his voice crackling with the glee of discovery. "Henderson's been running the HOA like his personal piggy bank for years. Special assessments for community projects, that never materialized, maintenance contracts awarded to companies that exist only on paper, specifically, a shell corporation linked to his brother-in-law. The breadcrumbs were turning into a loaf, then a bakery. The fraudulent lien on my property wasn't an isolated act of madness. It was the desperate gambit of a man whose schemes were about to unravel. Or perhaps the arrogant overreach of someone who believed he was untouchable. We cross-referenced property records with HOA meeting minutes, those that weren't conveniently lost, and a pattern emerged. Other properties, particularly those owned by out-of-towners or the elderly, showed suspicious lien activity, fines levied for nebulous infractions, followed by quiet pressure to sell, often to investors, with surprisingly close ties to Henderson or his cronies on the board. It was a racket, a slow, creeping annexation of the neighborhood, funded by the very residents he purported to serve. My legal training, the part of me that could dissect statutes and case law with surgical precision, went into overdrive. We weren't just dealing with HOA overreach. This was potentially wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. The stakes were rising. The initial plan to simply reclaim my property felt insufficient. This demanded a more comprehensive solution, a public reckoning. The tactical ops metaphor was no longer a metaphor. We were gathering intelligence, identifying targets, preparing for a multi-front assault. My sidekick, Marcus, was more of a co-general in this unfolding war. His conspiracy theories, once a source of amusement, now seemed chillingly prescient. These guys always think they're smarter, he mused, until someone who actually is smarter shines a very bright, very uncomfortable light on their little clubhouse. The sheer audacity of Henderson was a marvel. He wasn't just a petty tyrant. He was a delusional one, convinced of his own infallibility. The power paragraphs of evidence we were assembling, bank statements, forged signatures, digital communications, sworn affidavits from now emboldened former board members who'd been pushed out or silenced, were building not just a case, but a narrative of sustained, calculated corruption. The cold-blooded calm I maintained was essential. This required meticulous planning, not impulsive anger. Each document was a bullet, each piece of evidence a carefully aimed shot. The intensely personal nature of the initial insult was now channeled into a broader, more devastating campaign for justice. We weren't just fighting for my home, we were fighting for the very soul of the community Henderson had so thoroughly poisoned. The first legal salvos were launched with the precision of smart bombs. A strongly worded cease and desist, personally delivered by a process server whose grim satisfaction was almost palpable, landed on the polished desk of Pioneer Trust's president. It outlined, in excruciating detail, the fraudulent nature of the claim and the bank's potential liability, hinting at regulatory scrutiny and public exposure they would find deeply unpalatable. The chirpy confidence of their earlier calls vanished, replaced by a flurry of panicked internal communications that Marcus, through means I didn't inquire too closely about, managed to intercept. Simultaneously, a formal complaint, thick as a small-town phone book, was filed with the State Attorney General's office, detailing the HOA's fraudulent activities, naming Henderson and his keyboard allies. This wasn't a request. It was a demand for investigation, backed by an initial tranche of irrefutable evidence. Henderson's response, when it came, was predictable. A blustering, dismissive letter from the HOA's long-suffering and likely underpaid attorney, full of righteous indignation and thinly veiled threats of countersuits for defamation. It was the desperate roar of a paper tiger. My inner monologue was laced with a dry, deadpan sarcasm. Defamation, Henderson? One needs a reputation to defame. His arrogance was his Achilles' heel. He couldn't conceive that someone would not only dare to challenge him but would do so with such overwhelming force and meticulous preparation. He still saw me as just another disgruntled homeowner, not the architect of his imminent downfall. The power dynamics were shifting, palpably. The silent majority of neighbors, sensing a change in the wind, began to emerge from the shadows. Whispered stories became hushed phone calls, then tentative offers of information, old grievances, copies of suspicious notices. They were the rebellion fodder, timid at first, but growing bolder as they saw Henderson's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. My family, my emotional anchor, watched this escalation with a mixture of apprehension and fierce pride. My son started asking questions about legal strategy, his earlier shock replaced by a keen interest in the mechanics of justice. Sarah became the unofficial liaison, with the growing network of concerned neighbors, her calm empathy a counterpoint to my focused intensity. The legally lethal tone wasn't just a posture, it was a promise. Every legal filing, every communication, was designed to constrict, to expose, to dismantle. The cold, tactical approach was yielding results, forcing the antagonists onto the defensive, compelling them to make mistakes. Henderson, I knew, would overplay his hand. Narcissists always do, and I would be there with surgical precision to exploit every error. The next phase required enlisting an official legal ally, someone with the power to turn our meticulously gathered evidence into indictments. I reached out to Ava Ramirez, an assistant district attorney I'd mentored years ago, a woman with a razor-sharp mind and an intolerance for corruption that matched my own. I laid out the case, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a former colleague presenting a meticulously prepared prosecution memo. The binders of evidence, the timelines, Marcus's digital forensics reports, it was a prosecutor's dream, a case tied up with a neat, damning bow. Ava, initially skeptical as any good prosecutor should be, listened intently, her expression shifting from polite interest to focused intensity as the scale of Henderson's enterprise became clear. "He sold your house," she'd repeated, the incredulity in her voice a satisfying echo of my own initial shock, with a fake lien through a local bank. By the end of our meeting, her jaw was set. "This isn't just HOA fraud. This is organized crime, suburban edition," she stated, the morally unflinching steel in her voice reassuring. The reluctant authority figure was now fully engaged. The wheels of official justice, often slow and ponderous, began to turn with uncharacteristic speed, greased by the sheer weight of our evidence. Subpoenas were issued, hitting the HOA, Pioneer Trust, and Henderson personally, like a sudden hailstorm. Bank records, which Pioneer Trust had been so reluctant to discuss with me, were now demanded under penalty of law. HOA meeting minutes, conveniently misfiled, were suddenly found. Henderson's personal finances, I suspected, would reveal a lifestyle far exceeding the legitimate income of an HOA president. The net was tightening, and the squirming had begun. Marcus, monitoring digital chatter, reported panicked calls between Henderson and certain board members, and frantic deletions of files from HOA computers, futile gestures. As he'd already secured mirrored drives, the explosive emotional undercurrents were now palpable, not within me, but radiating from our targets. Their composure was cracking, replaced by the frantic energy of cornered rats. My neighbors, the rebellion fodder, were now actively assisting, providing affidavits, recalling specific instances of Henderson's overreach and financial irregularities. The silent majority had found its voice, and it was a chorus demanding accountability. My cold-blooded calm remained, a stark contrast to the rising panic on the other side. Each step was deliberate, calculated. Step 1, uncover. Step 2, expose. Step 3, dismantle. We were well into Step 2, with Step 3 rapidly approaching. The surgical precision of our approach was designed not just to reclaim what was stolen, but to ensure such a brazen abuse of power could not easily happen again in our community. The pressure was building, a slow, inexorable tightening of the noose. Law enforcement, initially a peripheral presence, became a more visible component of the unfolding drama. Unmarked cars were occasionally seen near Henderson's house, or parked discreetly observing the comings and goings at the HOA community office, a small, self-important building that Henderson treated as his personal Kremlin. The local corruption ties we suspected began to surface. not through dramatic confessions, but through the dry, undeniable language of subpoenaed bank records and communication logs. A particular loan officer at Pioneer Trust, it turned out, had a suspiciously cozy relationship with Henderson, rubber-stamping paperwork with a alacrity that suggested either profound incompetence or active complicity. A notary public, whose stamp appeared on several questionable HOA documents, including the fraudulent lien against my property, was discovered to be Henderson's cousin. The threads were not just numerous, they were interwoven, forming a tapestry of petty greed and local influence peddling. The dramatic lighting changes on these emotional beats were internal for me, a flare of cold satisfaction as another piece clicked into place, a grim acknowledgement of the rot we were unearthing. On-screen text, in my mind's eye, scrolled through damning emails and financial transfers. The intensely personal fury I'd felt at the sight of that sold sign had now broadened into a systemic campaign. This wasn't just about my acres of land. It was about the principle of accountability. It was about drawing a line. My family remained my rock. Sarah, bless her, fielded calls from increasingly anxious neighbors, her calm demeanor a soothing balm on the raw nerves of the community. My son was now following the unfolding case with the intensity of a legal scholar, occasionally offering surprisingly astute observations. Their unwavering support was the emotional bedrock that allowed me to maintain my cold-blooded calm with explosive emotional undercurrents, the undercurrents being a fierce, protective loyalty that fueled every calculated move. We were moving towards the public reckoning, but before the final act, there was a desire, a need, to see Henderson confront the reality of his crumbling empire, not in a sterile courtroom, but in his own domain. The climactic confrontation wouldn't be an outburst of rage, but a precisely delivered monologue. Each word, a carefully placed scalpel. The HOA had scheduled an emergency meeting, ostensibly to discuss recent unfounded allegations. It was the perfect stage. The HOA emergency meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a room usually reserved for Tupperware parties and dismal potlucks. Tonight, it crackled with an uncharacteristic tension. Henderson, flanked by his remaining board loyalists, a collection of nervous sycophants who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, stood at a makeshift podium, attempting to project an air of aggrieved authority. He launched into a rambling defense, blaming disgruntled elements and outside agitators for the turmoil. The deadpan sarcasm in my soul was working overtime. Outside agitators? Henderson, I pay your damned salary, you insufferable twit. I let him dig his hole a little deeper, watched him spin his web of lies, his voice growing louder, more belligerent, as if volume could substitute for veracity. The neighbors, a larger turnout than I'd ever seen, sat in stony silence, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and a dawning, fragile hope. When he finally paused, inviting questions he clearly didn't want, I rose. The room hushed. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried to every corner of the room. Mr. Henderson, I began, you speak of unfounded allegations. Let's discuss some facts, shall we? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The legally lethal precision of my words was weapon enough. I laid out, point by point, a condensed version of the evidence: the fraudulent lien, the shell corporations, the misappropriated funds, the complicity of the bank. I didn't present it as accusation, but as established fact, referencing specific documents, dates, and account numbers. With each statement, I saw a flicker of panic in Henderson's eyes, a tick developing at the corner of his mouth. His bluster began to deflate, like a punctured blimp. You claim the HOA was acting in the community's best interest when it attempted to fraudulently seize and sell my property, Mr. Henderson? A property, I might add, that has been in my family for 3 generations, with all dues and obligations meticulously met. A low murmur went through the crowd. The monologue, heavy with strategic inner commentary, was now playing out externally, each sentence a tactical strike. I then addressed the bank's involvement, the conveniently overlooked details, the rush to list my property. Pioneer Trust, I said, my gaze sweeping over the anxious faces, will soon be answering to state and federal regulators for their role in this scheme. More murmurs. Henderson tried to interrupt, to bluster, but his voice was weaker now, his bravado gone. I held up a hand, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, yet it silenced him. This isn't about disgruntled elements, Mr. Henderson. This is about theft. It's about a breach of fiduciary duty so profound it borders on the sociopathic. It's about the abuse of power by a man who mistook his neighbor's decency for weakness. The dramatic with surgical precision element was in full play. This wasn't a shouting match, it was an execution. His public embarrassment was a necessary step, a precursor to the official reckoning. The morally unflinching stance was not just mine. It was now reflected in the hardening expressions of my neighbors. They saw him, finally, not as a powerful authority, but as a common thief. The public reckoning arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet efficiency of law enforcement officers serving warrants. It was a Tuesday morning. I was drinking coffee, looking out at my reclaimed driveway, the "Sold" sign long gone, replaced by a no trespassing notice that carried the full weight of my resolve. Marcus called. "It's happening," he said, his voice tight with satisfaction. "They're picking up Henderson at his house. The bank president got a visit too. Looks like your friend Ava isn't messing around. News crews, tipped off by sources I could only guess at, perhaps a newly emboldened former board member, or even Marcus himself, who had a flair for the dramatic-y, were already converging on Henderson's cul-de-sac and the pristine facade of Pioneer Trust. The on-screen text of local news headlines began to flash across my mental screen. HOA president arrested in massive fraud scheme. Local bank implicated in property theft ring. The HOA board, or what was left of it, crumbled within hours. Resignations poured in, emailed from hastily secured personal accounts. The community, once cowed into silence, was now abuzz, a mixture of outrage, relief, and a strange, almost giddy sense of liberation. My phone didn't stop ringing. Neighbors, some I barely knew, calling to express their thanks, to share their own stories of Henderson's petty tyrannies, now feeling safe enough to speak. The righteous fury I had initially felt had served its purpose. It had fueled the meticulous, cold, calculated vengeance. If vengeance is the right word for the systematic application of legal and moral consequence, perhaps justice is cleaner, though it felt far more personal than that. I reflected on the moral cost of action. There is always a cost. The peace of our neighborhood had been shattered, trust eroded. But sometimes, to lance a boil, you have to endure the pain of the incision. The alternative, allowing the infection to fester, was unthinkable. The suburban horror had indeed turned into a war zone, albeit one fought with legal briefs and forensic reports rather than bullets. The victory was not just mine, it was a communal exorcism. The arrest warrants, the news headlines, these were the public declarations that the reign of a petty despot was over. The climactic confrontation had played out in stages. The HOA meeting humiliation, followed by the chillingly impersonal process of arrest. Henderson's exaggerated control issues had led him to a place where he had no control at all, a back seat of a police car, his empire of forged documents and inflated ego reduced to a case number. This was the public embarrassment made manifest, the first-person retaliation opera reaching its crescendo. The aftermath was a landscape of legal debris and shattered reputations. My house, my land, were unequivocally mine again, the fraudulent claims expunged from the record as if they were a stain meticulously scrubbed clean. The locked gate at the end of my driveway wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of psychological closure, a return to control, the porch light a beacon of reclaimed sanctuary. The legal battles for others, for the full extent of the financial restitution from the HOA's depleted coffers, and the deeply compromised Pioneer Trust, would continue for some time. Class action lawsuits were already being drafted by enterprising local attorneys who smelled blood and contingency fees in the water. But the primary objective, the removal of Henderson, and the dismantling of his corrupt apparatus was achieved. His trial, and those of his key accomplices, promised to be a lengthy, sordid affair, laying bare the intricate network of deceit he had woven. For me, the somber resilience settled in. The intense personal battle had ended, but the memory of the violation, the sheer audacity of it, would linger. It served as a reminder that vigilance is never a part-time occupation, even in the quietest of suburbs. My family, my unwavering anchor, began to heal. The fear in my son's eyes had been replaced by a new, more mature understanding of the world, that monsters exist, even in manicured lawns, but they can be faced, and they can be beaten. Sarah, with her quiet strength, helped to rally the neighbors, not for revenge, but for rebuilding, for creating a new HOA structure built on transparency and genuine community interest, not on the whims of a narcissistic personality. The tactical justice fantasy had become a hard-won reality. The military mind versus HOA tyranny had proven that meticulous planning and unwavering resolve could overcome even entrenched local corruption. My weaponized narration had served its purpose, both as an internal focusing mechanism and, in its retelling, perhaps as a cautionary tale. I never wanted to be a reluctant warrior in my own neighborhood. I had sought peace, a quiet life. But when they crossed that line, when they came for the heart of my existence, the choice was made for me. The blood metaphor, the moral cost, was real. It was the cost of complacency averted, the price of allowing such things to go unchallenged. As I stood on my porch, watching the evening sun filter through the leaves of my grandfather's trees, I felt a cold, hard satisfaction. They didn't know who I was. Now they did. And the most important rule, the one Henderson so spectacularly failed to grasp, was now etched into the community's memory. Don't mess with a man's home. Especially when that man knows how to dismantle yours, piece by fraudulent piece.